This is Make Something Cool. I'm Alex Sugg. Today, I'm really excited to be sitting down with Rory Sutherland. Rory is the vice chairman of Ogilvy Group, one of the most legendary ad agencies in the world, and he is also an incredible author. Rory, thanks for being on the show.
Oh, it's a huge pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. I was first introduced to you. A friend told me about a book he was reading called Alchemy, and he just was explaining how it was kind of blowing his mind. And he passed it on to me, and it definitely struck a lot of chords that I hadn't really explored before, specifically in how the human, it's kind of interesting because it's a book about advertising, marketing, building products, things like that. But really, it's a book about human psychology, which is really, or at least that's how I kind of read it, is how people think.
I suppose somebody once said that effectively it's really about, it starts with the vagaries of human perception.
Right.
And so if you had to really fancify it, you'd say it exists in the realm of phenomenology or something of that kind.
Yeah.
But I mean, there are a few central, I think the reason it's difficult for people to think of the world this way isn't because it requires spectacular brain power or a flash of amazing insight. I think it just requires you to let go of three assumptions simultaneously, which people find discomforting. One of which is that we perceive the world objectively, when evolution isn't remotely interested in accuracy, it's only interested in survival. And therefore, it will present the world to us in a way that maximizes our overall fitness,
right,
rather than a way that actually maximizes an accurate representation of the world. And the fact, of course, that the role that the emotions play in our decision-making and our action and our response to information, where we can't really bypass them, try as we might. And also, I suppose, the subordinate role that conscious reasoning often plays in what we do relative to what you might call the adaptive unconscious. It's a very good book I'm rereading, or rather re-listening to at the moment on Audible, which is Timothy Wilson's Strangers to Ourselves. And if you think about it, if you think that to some extent most living creatures don't really have a faculty of reason to the extent that humans do, and that it appears that it evolved late, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that our faculty of reason sits on top of a whole load of pre-existing, less conscious instincts and decision-making processes, and maybe inherited heuristics,
right,
which are still there,
right,
operating below the realms of consciousness. And so understanding how we respond to things emotionally is vital, I think, if you wish to understand human behavior or seek to influence it or predict it. Not understanding it, I think, can lead you to make very, very expensive mistakes.
Right. Yeah.
Listening to people literally and saying, their literal post-rationalized explanations of why they do something or what they would do under certain circumstances can be an extraordinarily expensive mistake, because it can lead to a massive misdirection of effort.
Right.
And that's why my second book, co-written with Pete Dyson, is about transport, because I think transport is a particularly acute area where everybody optimizes around physical SI units like speed and time, duration and punctuality.
Yeah.
When what consumers may value may be something entirely different.
Right. Yeah, I would love to get into that book as well. I think that's kind of what struck me about Alchemy and reading it is, this idea that humans want to be logic, or we think we're more logical than we are, maybe, is a better way to put it. So especially...
By the way, it's very easy we're very good at post-rationalizing. And we can nearly always tell a plausible story about why we did something in the past.
Right.
And as a result, I think, because we're very good at post-rationalizing and constructing a fairly straightforward narrative from our past, we mistakenly think it's similarly easy to construct the same narrative about the future. Whereas, of course, the future, we have a view of the past which is much more deterministic than it really was at the time.
Right.
We see things as being inevitable when they weren't, for example. We see things as the product of intention, conscious intention, when they weren't.
Right.
And then what we tend to do is project that forward into the future, which I think is a fundamental mistake.
Right. Can you give an example of this, maybe, that you've seen in your work? Like what's a mistake maybe that you've witnessed where we assume the quote unquote logical route is the way to go, but then you see in hindsight maybe it was incorrect.
One thing I noticed, it helps to be old, and this features quite heavily in the book, is the fact that an enormous number of very, very successful businesses and business sectors, and I would include, say, Starbucks, Five Guys, actually, you go back to McDonald's, although I obviously don't predate McDonald's, Dyson, okay, it would be impossible to construct in advance of their existence a rational case for their creation. Red Bull is the other example.
Yeah, I love that story.
If you think about it, it's an expensive drink in a tiny can, which tastes kind of disgusting. Okay.
Right.
No person who required logical support for any investment or any new product development, no large corporation could have created Red Bull, in fact, because it defies rational justification and pre-existing evidence to too great an extent.
Right.
But what I think often happens is there's a kind of Darwinian market process where some products, sometimes I think intentionally through the genius of their creator, but possibly more often simply through good fortune, simply happen to satisfy an unmet need on the part of customers.
Yeah.
And it's often an unmet need because it's unthought and unspoken.
Right.
But once satisfied, so an interesting thing, if you dig back on, if you take Red Bull as an example, and then I dug back a bit further, we've probably evolved not really to like unfamiliar drinks very much, because we're very cautious about what we drink. And in fact, one of the points I make, which is the point raised by Mark Changizi, who's a very interesting psychophysicist, is that the reason water doesn't taste of anything is so that humans are better at detecting anything in water that shouldn't be there.
Wow. Okay.
So if you think about it, water has a bland taste, so that if there is a dead sheep 200 yards upstream, we kind of go, there's something I don't quite like about this water. We get a bit Larry David about the tap water. Yes. Okay. And if water tasted like Dr. Pepper, which it could do, I mean, there's a parallel brain system where water tasted like Coke or Dr. Pepper or whatever, okay, we wouldn't notice when something was contaminating it to the same level. So we're calibrated not to notice the taste of water, the better to notice other things that happen to be there. And so it's perfectly possible to imagine a version of the human brain where water really tasted of something.
Right.
And it wouldn't be to our evolutionary advantages to have that. But the interesting thing I think to understand there is that when unfamiliar drinks have been launched, this is true of Coke, it's true of Pepsi, it's true of tea, it's true of coffee, okay? It's probably, although alcohol goes back before the historical record, probably true of alcohol, that those things were first promoted medicinally.
Okay.
That there's a kind of weird mental thing that if you're ill or unwell, it might be a moment in which you actually drink strange tasting potions or substances.
Sure, yeah.
A Pepsi Cola is called Pepsi because it's eupeptic cola. It was an aid to digestion, for example. And it interests me that Red Bull, coffee, tea were all introduced as psychoactive, psychotropic, medicinal. There's a strong placebo element to weird tasting things, I think.
Right. So with Red Bull, in that instance, Red Bull was presented as an energy drink, basically. So an
energy drink. It gives you wings. It had everything: high price, small measured dosage, weird taste, and of course, even better, it was banned for sale to people under 16, which is almost a gift if you want 16-year-olds or 15-year-olds to want something.
Exactly. I know for me, when I was 16, that's all I wanted is what I couldn't have. So, that's so interesting. That makes a lot of sense.
So it's very interesting because I think the idea that you can, either using market research or economic models or logical models, the idea that you can necessarily tell what people want in advance is pretty unsafe. I mean, I always give the example of Dyson, which is there was absolutely nobody in 1995 going around going, why isn't there a £700 vacuum cleaner?
Right.
A $700, $800 vacuum cleaner. If someone had come to me with that idea, I would have given them 5 reasons why it was a very silly idea. It's a distress purchase. You only buy a vacuum cleaner when you have to.
Right.
Nobody has suggested that, vacuum cleaners be belong in the field of treats or luxury goods,
Right.
up until Dyson accidentally, I think, stumbled on that. Most people who could afford an £800 vacuum cleaner may not even hoover their own homes.
Right.
There was no evidence in the marketplace that there was any gap in the market. If you looked at the kind of normal distribution of vacuum cleaner expenditure, it would have centered around about the $150, $200 mark, I guess,
right,
with Miele at the top and various things at the bottom.
Right. So why do you think Dyson worked? Why did it work?
Well, I'll be absolutely candid. He thinks probably, he may not, I don't know. In fairness to him, he's both an engineer, but he is also a devotee of design. One of the reasons, I think, is that it's transparent. I don't think it's the baglessness. The baglessness, if anything, is a mild disadvantage because one thing about vacuum cleaner bags is they're very easy to empty and dispose of,
right,
compared to a vacuum cleaner where you have to tip the contents into a bin. I think the fact that it looked unbelievably cool contributed. I also think the fact that it's transparent, there is something inherently satisfying about seeing the dirt that it collects in real time.
Right. That makes sense.
You're less keen in the United States on front-loading washing machines, aren't you? You tend to have top loaders.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, the sort of big Maytag thing with a vertical, effectively a drum which rotates around a vertical axis. In Europe, because our washing machines tend to go in kitchens underneath the work surface, they're front loading and they tend to have a glass door. And those things, seemingly trivial things, may play a much greater part in preference than we ever admit.
Right. Right.
The fact that you can watch your washing as it goes through the wash cycle, spin cycle, may just make you derive much more satisfaction for the activity than having a metal door, which is opaque.
Right, where you can't see what's happening. It feels like...
The way I often refer to this is that there are, in the case of many products, there's an official reason why we buy them. And it's a bit like JP Morgan's comment that for anything people do, there are two reasons. There's a good reason and there's the real reason.
Right, yeah.
I often say that the real reason people clean their teeth is really vanity and fear of bad breath,
right,
much more than it is fear of dental decay. That's why all toothpaste is flavored with mint. Even though a lot of people don't actually like mint, it does a great job of making your mouth feel fresh and unsmelly. In the same way, I had a sort of riff with Nassim Taleb about this. The reason people buy a dishwasher is not so much to wash their plates and knives, it's to have a place to put dirty crockery out of sight.
Okay.
The real value of a dishwasher isn't necessarily what it does while it's turned on. It's also what it does while it's turned off. And then the other joke was, the reason you buy a swimming pool is not necessarily to swim in. It's because if you own a swimming pool, you have a license to walk around your garden in a bathing costume in the summer without feeling like an idiot.
Yes,
okay.
I like it.
So, there are an awful lot of things which fascinate me. I keep wondering, no one has quite created an ice cream that you can take into the office, have they?
They have not yet.
I'm trying to have, I've got a can of this stuff in front of me, and I think I mentioned this in the talk. Is this the same in the US, where San Pellegrino, the flavored drinks, actually have a foil lid
They do.
on the top of the can?
Yeah. It's always been a little magic on top.
And for a variety of reasons. Now, the rational explanation for that is that it's hygiene.
Keeps
that you
it clean.
remove the lid,
Keeps
and
it clean,
therefore
right.
you can confidently drink out of the can knowing that rats didn't crawl over it in some warehouse.
Right.
And that's a reason.
Sure.
Now, I bet the finance director of San Pellegrino has been trying to get rid of those things for ages.
Right, yeah.
What they also mean, in some strange way, is that you could have 20 cans of San Pellegrino on a side table at your wedding, when you couldn't do the same with 10 cans of Fanta.
Right.
If you went to a posh picnic, you could hand out cans of San Pellegrino with that little foil lid in a way you couldn't hand out ordinary undressed cans.
Right.
I mean, there's also a degree of pleasure, rather like ex-smokers or, always miss opening the pack. The extraordinary ritual of opening the pack.
Sure.
But there's something going on there which is not simply the rational hygiene component. It changes the meaning of the drink.
Sure.
And it changes the consumption opportunities for the drink.
Right. And just the perception of the value of it. Like suddenly it's, I would spend more on that. suddenly I would.
It probably licenses a price point which is significantly higher. That, the margin that arises from that foil thing is probably, I don't know, a factor of 10, 20, 30 times that of the cost of putting on the foil. And one of the things I say is that actually, if you allow a business to become completely controlled by rational people, in other words, if you can't do anything your finance director doesn't like, it's difficult for you to create a brand with meaning, because meaning tends to be conveyed by things which are slightly gratuitous. Do you see what I mean? That actually, if, for example, what would be an example? Okay, in a hotel, there are loads of things a hotel does. Your room doesn't leak. It's reasonably warm. It has a mini bar in it, etc., etc.
Right.
And all those things are pretty much table stakes. But if you check into the DoubleTree Hotel and they give you a cookie, I don't know if you must have had this experience as an American.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever stayed at a DoubleTree?
I have.
Right. And they have an oven underneath the check-in desk, and they hand out the bag of signature DoubleTree cookies, which are warm and fantastically delicious.
Right.
Okay. That actually provides differentiation and meaning and a sense of hospitality precisely because it's slightly unnecessary.
Right.
Okay. In a way that, reliable door hinges don't actually attract our attention. And so our attention is drawn to the unexpected.
Wow.
And there's a fine line between unexpected and what a finance director would call the first thing you kill when you're making budget cuts.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And so, there's a huge danger that businesses run through a mentality of cost control become somehow kind of dehumanized and slightly arid.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you...
Just occasionally, I'll tell you a place where this is really cute. If you think about it, politeness and good manners are really all about slightly gratuitous effort.
Yeah.
It's the things you do that you don't absolutely have to do, holding a door open for someone, bringing someone a chair, etc. It's the fact that you do them when you don't have to that gives them meaning.
Right.
And I often say one place where there's a very acute distinction is if you ever ring up a call center. Okay. Occasionally you get a call center where clearly the staff are metriced. The call center staff have a metric other than merely the speed of call handling, how quickly you can solve a problem and get them off the line. And they devote 5, 10, 15 seconds to some level of interpersonal, gratuitous, pleasant exchange. Right. Okay. Now the interesting thing is the objective accomplishment of your task through calling the call center has been made slightly slower, and it's been made slightly costly. What's different, however, is your emotional response to the experience can be dramatically different.
Oh yeah, you don't want to
really hugely.
You don't want to throw the phone. You don't want to.
Also, you feel like a customer, not like a supplicant. You don't feel as if this company, who you are giving a large amount of money to, is deigning to speak to you for the minimum possible period of time. Instead, you actually feel that someone in the company actually cares about your long-term well-being and your lifetime value as distinct from transactional value.
Right.
And it feels different in the way that going to your favorite bar where the barman feels different from stopping at a, let's say, a restaurant on in a I'd call it a motorway service station, a kind of truck stop.
Sure. Oh yeah.
Right. There is transient transactional capitalism and there's relational capitalism. And I don't think economists and finance people really distinguish between the two, but they feel what they generate as a feeling is very, very different.
Yeah. How do you cultivate that mindset? Because I think it's, especially if you are an entrepreneur, business owner, even just a creator in general, it can be really easy to fall into systems thinking and even just like not even monetary budgeting, but even just like time budgeting. That's something I feel like I fall into is like, I don't make space for magic as much as I want to. How do you do that?
In a weird way, people don't, there's a very strong, among people who have a very reductionist mindset, and it's worth noting that management consultants often come from a finance or engineering background. Okay. There is an element which we have to resist where psychological solutions feel like cheating. I think that's particularly true in Silicon Valley, by the way, because your peer group in Silicon Valley is other coders.
Right.
Okay. And you want to impress your peer group with your superior coding ability, not with your superior grasp of human psychology.
Right.
On the other hand, I would argue that some of the most brilliant examples of software design are brilliant because they're psychologically ingenious. I mean, I'll give you two nice examples of that. The Uber map I always talk about, it doesn't reduce your waiting time. It massively reduces the pain of uncertainty that you experience while waiting.
Right. Yeah, you know exactly where they are, how far they are. Right.
How far, and also what the license plate is, so you don't try and get into the wrong car or anything like that.
Yeah.
You know, that a few of the elements of painful uncertainty, which were always thought to be an unavoidable component of just booking and waiting for a taxi, have been eliminated through psychological means, not through engineering means. A beautiful example of gratuitous generosity, which I love, is a fantastic little app for British Gas, which is you use it to input it's on a smartphone, you use it to input your meter reading. Okay. Now in the UK, many gas meters, many electricity meters are in a kind of, cobweb strewn cupboard underneath the stairs, or they're in some weird inaccessible place. Right. And the one thing they just add on this is a little switch which turns on the light on your mobile phone. So on the very same page of the app, as it were, where you input the reading, you can flick a little switch and turn your telephone into a torch. Now, what I mean about that is it's almost a moment of human connection that you have seen the world not through your own narrow, efficiency-driven corporate lens.
Right. You've
actually bothered to see the world the way I see it.
Right, in the dark cupboard under the stairs.
And you realize, actually, I know when we tested this app, I know we used perfect lighting conditions, and so on.
Right.
But in reality, those conditions aren't going to pertain for most people most of the time. And there's a lovely example of a very, very popular hotel on TripAdvisor called the Magic Castle Hotel in Los Angeles. And objectively, there's nothing that special about the hotel. I mean, it's got an old building. It's the location isn't brilliant. But what's fascinating about it is it always comes in the kind of top 10 hotels in LA on TripAdvisor. And it has one or two of these absolutely gratuitous pieces of... There's a Japanese thing called Kano theory, which describes it. Kano theory divides product attributes into three. There are table stakes, things which, if they are not present, render the product useless. If that would be an orange juice carton where it persistently leaked,
right,
or a hotel room where there was a drip coming through the ceiling.
Sure.
Okay. Doesn't matter what you do. If those hygiene factors aren't there, you're dead in the water. Then there are performance attributes which there tends to be a linear or possibly slightly declining relationship between performance and customer satisfaction. And then there are these weird things called delight attributes, which are seemingly slightly gratuitous, where they're almost tangential to the main function of the business, but they disproportionately contribute to customer delight. And this comes from a guy called Kano at the University of Tokyo. He was very majorly an influence on the Japanese, both, I think, the car and particularly the consumer electronics industries. But this hotel, the Magic Castle Hotel, next to the pool has a popsicle hotline. And you just pick up a red phone and you say, I'd like some popsicles. And someone comes out with a tray covered in ice cream, what we call ice lollies in the UK. And you're more likely your kids can have a free popsicle.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And I noticed when they return your laundry, it's wrapped in brown paper, it's tied with a knot, but there's a sprig of, I think, rosemary, if I've got that right, on top of the laundry.
Yeah.
And so they've taken, in some ways, they've taken a hotel in terms of its basic attributes. Now, do not think you can do this and have a totally shit hotel. Doesn't work like that.
Right.
But they've taken a basic hotel. The performance attributes are pretty good, but they've overlaid 2 or 3 of these kind of delight attributes. Apparently the service levels are enchanting as well. The staff are just really, really likable and helpful. But it's a very interesting example because, a standard logical entity like, the Sheraton or the, Holiday Inn might have to spend a fortune on rational things to get in the top 10 TripAdvisor hotels for Los Angeles.
Right.
And these people have done it really over time. Bear in mind, it's probably taken time to achieve this, but they've done it predominantly with cute.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And we just like cute. I mean, the way we emotionally respond to things, it's I would say it's not enough for a business to be customer centric. The business has to be amygdala centric. It has to understand the emotions of its customers very well, because there's no overriding them. As the Oscars showed.
Oh my gosh.
Okay.
Yeah.
Terrible thing, by the way. But the interesting thing, I think, is that, for instance, the example I always give to small shops is that one of the worst things you can do is allow a customer into your shop when you close at about 2 minutes to 5. And then when they come to the till and try and order something, you say, I'm sorry, we're closed.
Right.
Okay?
Right, yeah.
Because they don't interpret that as information about your closing time. They interpret it as a personal insult.
Right. Yep.
And all the worse because it takes place in a public setting. Now, by contrast, if you lock your shop at 5 o'clock, okay, you lock the front door, wait for people to come along. When they try the door, make a big show of unlocking the door and saying, I was actually closed, but why don't you come in?
Right.
That's an immensely flattering experience. Now, in terms of, it's a very, very interesting thing, which is that there are lots and lots of things which businesses can unwittingly do if they only obsess over objective measures,
right,
which are really emotional poison to customers.
Wow.
And I think the fact that, of course, we don't really have metrics for the amygdala.
Right. Yeah.
We have SI units of time and distance and speed and all that sort of thing.
Right.
Okay. But we don't really have any metrics to measure emotional response.
Right.
And as a result, it tends to get dangerously neglected.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's where you can't measure delight, on a spreadsheet, but it absolutely makes a difference,
The story I always tell about the DoubleTree is I said, look, it's very, very simple. I said, if you said, I last stayed in a DoubleTree and experienced the cookies in 1997. It's 25 years ago. I haven't stayed in a DoubleTree since. But if my PA said to me 25 years later, do you want to stay at the Marriott or the DoubleTree? They're about in the same location. I'd go cookies.
Oh, yeah.
5 years later.
Right, yeah.
Because, of course, the human brain, for perfectly sensible evolutionary reasons, pays disproportionate attention to things we don't expect.
Right.
And, I kind of expect a check-in desk. And this is why, by the way, sometimes the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea, because two extremes contain an element of novelty in a way that the average doesn't.
Yeah. What's an example of that?
In a sense, the general argument is, I think our senses take in something like 11 megabits of data a second. Okay. So like a pretty good, modem. Okay.
Right.
But we can rationally process something like 80 bits a second consciously. A large amount of the information we take in at any one point is probably just dumped as irrelevant.
Sure. Yep.
What makes sense is that we disproportionately downplay things that we expect in terms of our attentional economy, and we disproportionately direct attention to things that surprise us. And so meaning tends to be conveyed. I mean, that was why that Will Smith incident was so extraordinary. Partly because it was Will Smith.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. And so, that's why it holds extraordinary attention. If it had been someone with a history of violence or unpleasantness.
Yeah.
Okay. Nothing like the same. Also, by the way, extraordinary response by Chris Rock.
I know. I thought the same thing. I was like, wow.
In terms of professionalism.
Yeah.
I like to think I can handle myself on a stage.
I know.
I've never had to do anything close to that.
Yeah.
And the way in which he handled it was extraordinary.
I fully agree.
And also did not retaliate, by the way, which many people would have instinctively retaliated.
Totally. Yeah, I was very impressed by that. But I think you're right, though. Like, I think the reason it was so jarring was because of who it was and how unexpected, we've had...
He's he doesn't swear. It is, you know.
Yeah. I mean, how do you cultivate this mindset, though? Like, how do you get better at thinking? Maybe outside the box is the wrong term, but when it comes to this,
a bit of it is deep introspection. So again, large parts of the human brain, I think, are opaque to introspection. But I think you can look back on your behavior and go, what led me to believe this? What led me to do this?
Yeah.
And by the way, it's complicated because in many ways we couldn't function without an adaptive unconscious. Okay, we couldn't even begin to function or make decisions, and it's shown that actually people who've had particular brain damage or particular brain cancers, I think, who effectively have to rationalize most of their life decisions, effectively find it impossible to function because they find it very, very difficult to make decisions. Right. Without an emotional component to tip you one way or the other. Sure. You end up in a state of kind of decision paralysis.
Wow.
Which is very interesting.
Very, yeah.
But it's also, I think it's true to say that we don't have introspective access. Sometimes, I think it's also worth noting that sometimes the adaptive unconscious is very, very clever. Okay. And I would argue in many ways, consumers make more intelligent decisions when they purchase things than businesses do, because the business is constrained by what factual information you can convey to your colleagues to justify your decision.
Right.
Whereas a consumer only has to justify the decision to their own adaptive unconscious. Yeah. And is therefore free to use a much broader toolkit and a much broader informational palette in making a decision than someone who's required to defend their decision to somebody else.
Wow.
Okay. I think this is often a problem in politics, which is it's not enough to solve the problem. You have to prove that you have a rational approach to solving it.
Right.
And that makes it very difficult to play with magic because it makes it very, very difficult to use magic in an institutional context, if you like. Yeah. Because again, magic doesn't come with objective metrics attached. But the interesting thing is, but equally, it's worth noting that sometimes the adaptive unconscious can be a bit dumb because it's evolved for us to make decisions at high speed in the wild, as it were, much better than it's probably designed for making reflective decisions.
Yes. Right.
I mean, if you think about it, I can't remember what it is, but a huge proportion of the brain and our brain processing power is just devoted to sight, movement, and digestion.
Right. Yeah.
And in the wild, making a fast, pretty good decision was undoubtedly much better for survival than making a slow, slightly better decision.
Right, exactly.
So speed of decision-making in the natural environment was a huge evolutionary advantage, even if the decision wasn't perfect. It's rather like, you've probably had this experience. You're standing close to on the sidewalk and you jump backwards because your brain detects, a cyclist or a bus approaching.
Yes, every day.
And you jump off the road instinctively. Yeah. And what's interesting about that is, obviously, if you were asked to explain your actions, you would say, I heard the bus and I jumped backwards. Actually, probably you started jumping before you were consciously aware of the noise of the bus.
Right. Yeah.
There's all sorts of things like blind sight and, there seems to be a particular piece of hearing and a particular piece of vision, which basically goes straight. It doesn't go through the let's process this part of the brain. It saves a few milliseconds by going straight to the action part of the brain.
Yep.
That would probably be the same, when you put your hand on something too hot.
Yeah, exactly.
You would just instantly recoil without having to actually perform any mental calculus about this. And so, there is an argument that, there are elements of modern day decision-making where it pays to, caution or educate or, perhaps redirect the attention of the adaptive unconscious part of our decision-making apparatus. I was talking to Eric Johnson. He's written a very good book about choice, which just came out a few weeks ago, which is called The Elements of Choice. Actually, I'll wait. I'll show it to your lovely listeners.
Yes, please do.
There we are. There we go.
Okay, that's an excellent cover.
And one of the things we were talking about was the fact that it's very easy. If you decide you're moving, let's say you decide you're moving apartment, and then you get obsessed moving between two, you can't decide whether to move to one apartment or another apartment. One tip I would advise people is also consider in your decision set staying where you are.
Wow. Okay.
Because it might be that in the 6 months in which you're deliberating whether to move to one place or the other, your circumstances change significantly. This happened to me, actually. My wife and I spent ages considering whether to buy one new house or another new house in order to move. And after a few things had fallen through, there'd been an 8-month interval. I said, hold on a second. we've become so fixated on the differences between A and B that we've forgotten to consider whether either A or B is significantly better than where we now live.
Right.
And I said, since we started on this process, a new shops opened in the village, new pubs opened in the village. One of our daughters has started going to school very close to where we live, which we hadn't anticipated necessarily.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Are we really sure that it's worth the expense of a move?
Right. Yeah.
As much now, and actually we ended up staying where we were for another 15 years.
Wow.
And still there. And you save quite a lot of money, you save mortgage costs, you save moving costs. In the end, what we did was something totally different, was we bought a very small apartment somewhere else, about 70 miles away by the sea.
Nice. Yeah.
And so it is interesting in that one of the interesting things, Daniel Kahneman calls this Wisiati, which is what you see as all there is. And there is undoubtedly, because we've evolved to make decisions with limited information, in a situation where there wasn't time to find out more information because there was a massive premium on speed of decision making. Yeah. Quite often, Kahneman's example is you say, I've got these two candidates, one of them's more experienced, but the other one's got better educational qualifications. Which one should I hire?
Right.
And what's interesting is people will give an opinion. They will always give an opinion, and then they will back it up with a post-rationalized argument. What's very rare is people say, well, I don't know. I think you need to find out more about this or more about that. Have you spoken to people at their last place of work to find out what colleagues thought of them there? We've evolved effectively to make decisions with very limited amounts of information because that was what benefited survival. Quick decisions with what information happened to be available to us at the time without the luxury of spending time asking other questions.
Right.
And you notice this in the way people use dating sites and property websites. They don't worry enough when they set the criteria. Oh, I want to be within, I don't know. I want to be a property within, 2 miles of Lincoln Center or whatever it is you do in Manhattan. Okay.
Yeah.
They immediately then start comparing and contrasting all the property within their price range, within that radius, without for a minute thinking, shit, what if 200 yards outside that radius, there's an absolutely fantastic apartment, which I'm now never going to
see. Yep.
And so the extent to which we'll make decisions with a limited solution set very happily without seeking to expand the solution set. Because as long as each stage of our decision feels like an improvement, we're happy following the path dependency all the way down. Right. That strikes me as a bit strange.
Yeah.
If you move, I don't know if you're thinking of moving out of New York, there seems to be a bit of an exodus. Are you part of it or not?
We are not. We're one of the few that want to stay for a long, long time. So we love it here, but yeah.
Well, there is a point. There is a point, by the way. I'm fairly much a devotee of moving out, but I'm 56, right? In fairness. Yeah. Okay. And the second thing is, I had 10 or 12 years I was in London from 1988 to 1997. So, no, it was longer than that. Rubbish. Till 2000. So I was in London for 12 years, right in the middle of London. Okay. And one of the things I noticed is that the internet, in general, makes it less painful leaving a large city than would have been the case in, let's say, 1988. Because an awful lot of things can be delivered to you nationwide, including high-end foodstuffs, fancy goods. The retail advantage of New York over, say, Camden, New Jersey, okay, once you factor the internet in, isn't as stark. Okay, as it would have been in 1988.
Definitely. Oh yeah.
Okay, it's not as if Netflix is worse when you leave Manhattan. Yeah. Well, actually, if you moved to Connecticut, I imagine you had half the cable stations or something, didn't you, or a third of them?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Or you just had terrestrial TV if you moved somewhere really rural, I would guess.
Yep.
Okay, so there's been a huge geographical leveling, but at the same time, someone made a point to me which never occurred to me before, which I think is fair, which is they said that flexible working might make it better to live in a city. I said, well, surely flexible working means you don't have to commute so often, so it's much less expensive to live further out, and you can buy much better property with the same money. If you've only got to commute twice a week, you can buy better property, which is true, okay? And then they said, yeah, but if you can work late in the evening, but you're free on Wednesday afternoons, there's nothing like London on a Wednesday afternoon because it's not that crowded. Everything's open. You can go to galleries, exhibitions.
Right.
So if you can work flexibly, so you work early in the morning and late in the evening, and you leave 3 hours free in the middle of the day, being in a really big city is actually fantastic. You go to a matinee at the theatre.
Yeah.
You can go to a half-empty cinema.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had to say, that never occurred to me. But you're probably right. There are reasons to move out in the sense that
for sure.
if you don't have to commute 5 days a week, the premium you pay to be close to your place of work is obviously less crucial.
Yeah.
I'd also argue that, as you get a bit older, when you bring up children, there are big advantages just to having space, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's probably when we'll really consider it more, is when we start having kids and stuff like that. But for now, and to your point,
but it is fair. It is fair actually that Zoom is another thing. Which, in other words, the number of interesting conversations you can have is less constrained by geography. What you can buy is less constrained. What you can watch is less constrained. So there are in the 1980s and early 90s, when I went back to the Welsh market town where I grew up, from central London, I must admit, after 4 or 5 days, I was a bit bored.
Right. Yeah.
You really were a bit, you kind of went, it'd be quite nice to get some Korean food.
Right.
I suppose, that's probably a 30-mile drive.
Exactly.
If it were available at all back then. And that sort of thing has diminished quite a lot, actually.
Definitely. Yeah. I feel like we're not, to your point, a lot of the reason, I think New York for us is a great example of like, rationally, practically, financially, like we could live anywhere we want, but we stay here because of those intangible delights, and there's something.
Yes, I don't know.
Yeah.
And also, you're younger than me. There is an element where actually just a change is as good as the rest. I mean, one of the nice things about moving out is that driving becomes a pleasure again.
Yeah.
Nobody ever admits this, but people really, really enjoy driving. It's one of the most interesting things that emerges from research into happiness. And it's complicated. Actually, it's complicated. The one thing I did fight against, the one thing which I think I was right to fight against, is I said, all futurism assumes greater urbanism. And I said, I don't think that, I think that's a safe assumption for the young who have lots of reasons why they want to be in a megacity. But I said, the fact that you have 100 conferences on smart cities and you never have a conference on smart towns or smart suburbs even, strikes me that you've fallen in love with this kind of Le Corbusier high-density model, which is, in some respects, actually, if you look at people in high-density, high-rise housing, incidence of depression is quite a bit higher, incidence of schizophrenia is quite a lot higher. Mentally, high-density living isn't that great in many ways.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting.
So it's a very interesting it's a very interesting question because the one thing that did annoy me was that futurists tended to be urbanists.
Yeah, no, that's a really.
And I said, that's not a safe. You've bought into all the kind of metropolis stuff, and the Star Trek stuff.
Exactly.
And actually, to be honest, quite a lot of people, there's quite a lot to be said for suburbia, in fact, and nobody does because nobody ever says it because it's unfashionable.
Yes, exactly.
But
I like to say that, for millennials, our midlife crisis will not be buying fancy cars or getting goofy haircuts. It'll be going completely off the grid and going to live in the woods away from the internet. Like that's going to be our moment.
There is an interesting question, which is, and I don't think the housing exists, but if it were possible to buy kind of a pod accommodation in Manhattan, I think the interesting thing is, in many cases in London, it's illegal to build apartments below a certain size.
Oh, okay.
Unless you designate it student accommodation. But I think there are quite a lot of people who live out of London who would be quite happy with some sort of timeshare arrangement. With what is effectively a glorified hotel room in London.
Yeah, we know a lot of people who like go in on apartments together. So it'll be like five or six people who will like buy an apartment and then throughout the year they share it and they live elsewhere, but they come here.
That's a very, very shrewd thing to do, in fact. I think that's, because the cost when you divide it by 6 is fairly trivial. And you might argue that there are diminishing returns to being in a big city. You need to go there once every couple of weeks, but you don't, and it's good to have, one of the things I'd love to do is spend the time between Christmas and the New Year in London, which is the best time to be in London by miles. There are fewer tourists. A lot of people have left, but everything's open. It's absolutely glorious.
Yeah. So I think to kind of start winding down a little bit, Rory, what's a creative problem that you personally run into frequently? What's something that you, like a barrier that you come across often that you've had to learn how to overcome?
An awful lot of this stuff is really about framing, and it's about the fact that most people approach the world with a particular mental framework, which aids comprehension, but doesn't always, a fixed frame doesn't always aid creative problem solving. The way you solve problems is often by redefining the problem or by looking at it in a peculiarly new way. And therefore, the issue you most often face is that people often respond with surprising. It's the same in politics, okay? If you challenge someone's effective view of the world, they respond with instinctive defensiveness, as though an attack on someone's particular worldview or mental model of the world is an attack on them personally.
Right.
And it's useful in problem solving to be able to deploy a variety, what you might call quite a large mental toolkit, a variety of different models or frames. People have an instinctive preference for having just one. And furthermore, I think it's true to say that when you have an institution, frames get stuck in silos. So everybody within a given silo will look at the world in exactly the same way, with the same selection of metrics, targets, objectives, the same definitions of success. And it's then even more difficult because, of course, it's not only one person's view of the world you have to challenge, it's a whole collective embedded view of the world.
Right.
And I remember once, it was one of the most fascinating reactions I've ever come across, which is I was talking to someone in the rail industry and I simply said, you could reduce journey time on trains quite easily if you have a frequent service, and you could increase capacity by allowing people who'd booked a ticket on one train, who'd arrived at the station 30 or 40 or 50 minutes earlier, to board an earlier train whenever capacity was available. Okay, and this would reduce journey time. It would also increase capacity. Complicated, but allowing people to go earlier if there's a train leaving with empty seats is always a good idea.
Right.
Now, it's hard to understand in relation to trains. If you reframe it to getting people off the roof of the embassy compound in Saigon, it's fairly obvious, okay? You fill up every helicopter that leaves as far as there are people available to board.
Right.
Okay? You wouldn't say, I'm terribly sorry, mate, you're booked on the later departure, so this helicopter's going to leave half empty.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
Weirdly, when it's helicopters on rooftops, it's absolutely obvious what you do. When it's trains, it isn't quite so obvious. And it's very strange how our perception has a domain dependence of that kind.
Right.
And so allowing people who are already at the station to board an earlier train both reduces journey time and makes the best use of available capacity. And the person from a train company reacted with extreme annoyance to this. And then came up with the most ludicrous argument, which was, yes, but if you allow people to board trains earlier, you lose retail sales at the station. What? I thought you're a bloody transportation company.
Right.
You're not there to prop up. You're not there to prop up McDonald's and Burger King, mate.
Yeah.
And one of the things I do find very interesting is that people, when you suggest there are other ways of solving a problem other than the one they have become attached to, I saw something similar with electronic cigarettes, which is my prediction. I said that electronic cigarettes might be dangerous. We don't know yet. They might, on the other hand, be a fairly significant battle in the fights to help people quit, because they preserve the habit without preserving the carcinogenic delivery device of a cigarette.
Right.
And so they make either effectively harm reduction or possibly migrating out of nicotine addiction altogether. They make it easier. And my other prediction was that the health industry will react to electronic cigarettes almost universally with an instinctive urge to ban them. And they'll start saying things like, think of the children. Okay.
Mhm.
Well, I've got two children who are 20, they're at university. And let me tell you that worry number 473 is that they might take up vaping, right? Of all the life-threatening and disastrous and catastrophic addictions and habits they might develop at university, I don't think vaping really makes the first division, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Uh-huh.
And that always struck me as interesting, because the correct view is surely an open-minded approach where you say we will be alert to any possible risks. We'll be alert to the risk that vaping acts as a gateway drug to smoking, although the evidence of that is now so small as to be infinitesimal. The number of people who've actually tried vaping from being a non-smoker who then thought, hey, let's go on to the real thing, doesn't seem to me very significant. You get some bizarre statistics, like there's an epidemic of vaping among young people because 60% of people under the age of 19 have tried an electronic cigarette. Well, I mean, people under the age of 19 have tried everything.
Yeah.
Because that's what you do when you're 18.
Right.
Okay? It's a nonsensical argument. And so it does interest me that the worst thing you can do if you want to annoy someone is to suggest a solution to their problem using means outside their considered set. Now, why that is, I don't fully know. It'd be interesting to know whether it's a feeling that you're heavily invested in a solution and someone coming up with an alternative solution effectively implies to you emotionally that you've been wasting your time all along. I don't know. I genuinely don't know.
Yeah, maybe it exposes like the sunk cost fallacy. Where if you've become so attached to an idea of something, or you've invested time, money, effort into one solution, only to find out it's been the wrong one all along, it's really hard to let go.
The other thing I think was that had electronic cigarettes been invented by, let's say, a pharmaceutical company or by a government ministry, there might have been a greater level of acceptance. But the fact that they emerged as commercial devices, very much the product of the marketplace, with all kinds of exploration, massive new retail opportunities, vaping stores, springing up all over the place, petrol stations making money selling, electronic alternatives to smoking. It might have been that the idea that this came from the private sector was particularly disquieting to them. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's something you've got to be alert to, because genuinely people react to things emotionally first, and then they post-rationalize.
Right.
And generally when the post-rationalization is think of the children, when actually children can recover from more and more, I mean, I don't even worry if my 20-year-old children smoke that much. As long as they quit before they're 30, you can survive almost anything in your 20s.
Right.
I'd be much more worried about them getting addicted to something significantly psychotropic, which might mess them up long term.
Sure.
But I'm always a little bit suspicious when people immediately start advancing children,
right?
Because they've lost the argument in one sense, and they have to essentially then reference the vulnerable to prop up their falling argument.
That's a really good point. Yeah. I think it maybe is my last question, Rory. There basically people who listen to this show are, aspiring creators, whether that be, making podcasts, writing, illustrators, design, entrepreneurs. Maybe as a last thing to take us out, what's a piece of advice? Maybe it could be around thinking. Maybe it could be around creative work. What's something you'd leave maybe somebody with to pursue?
Possibly it's designed for a narrower set. So quite a lot of innovation is driven by people first developing things for the disabled, and then discovering that what is particularly useful and valuable to the disabled is also valuable to other people. Okay. That's true of, the example I always give is door handles. Okay. So door handles are mandated, I think, on many public buildings, because if you've lost the use of your hands, if you have rheumatoid arthritis, you can always escape from a fire with a door handle using an elbow or, part of your arm, whereas a door knob could present an absolutely impossible opportunity.
Right.
But then you realize that people who are carrying 2 mugs of coffee have also lost the use of their hands.
Right.
And so actually, we had a very great amount of UX success in, I think it was a parking app. And we said, actually, if you design for the disabled in a parking app, it's very good, because most people use a parking app when they're walking away from their car.
Right.
And therefore they're moving. They're walking towards a railway station or a shop or wherever it is they've paid to park. Therefore, fat finger design makes sense for everybody, not just people who have some particular impairment.
Yeah.
And so actually designing for extremes can be surprisingly successful. The other thing is, I mean, other things would be the opposite of a good idea is often a very good idea. And I think one of the things we have done is we've over-optimized the world for youth. I think there's an opportunity to actually choose an older target audience and look for them, because the world has been insanely over-optimized towards youth. I think we generally have over-optimized businesses towards automation and cost saving. And I think there will be scope in the future for businesses which actually offer, as an alternative, a very high level of personal service. Because I think we've moved everything online. In extreme cases, which really annoys me, you know, companies like Deliveroo making it app only. There isn't even a flaming website. Well, fuck's sake, I'm at home, right? I've got a 55-inch monitor, right? Which is the perfect way in which to order a meal. Why are you making me order this on a phone?
Right.
And actually, I think, I also think that there are areas where there is bizarrely little innovation in proportion to the time spent, which I include things like email. I think there's complete scope to reinvent email, for example. I think look for things too, which have, if your idea is just boringly sensible and logical, my suspicion is it won't actually catch in the human brain all that well. Build in a bit of incongruity, a bit of counterintuitiveness, a little bit of oddity. I'm always very fond. There's a chain in Ocean City, Maryland, which only sells French fries, and occasionally a little bit of. Let me work out. It's called Thrashers, I think it is actually, and it's. I think they've got 3 outlets in Ocean City, Maryland. And they've adopted a very odd policy where they won't serve ketchup. Now, that's not so weird in the United Kingdom. In the US, it's weird. They will only serve the fries with vinegar.
Okay.
And that's how they do it.
Yeah.
I think the other thing you can do is, I think most people, and there's a recent Roger L. Martin post about this, which is very interesting, which is most people, and particularly people with a kind of engineering or financial or deterministic mindset, most people are very uncomfortable with metaphor. And as a result, what they're very bad at doing is generalizing a finding in one area and transferring it to somewhere else. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think what behavioral science allows you to do is, by codifying findings about human instinct and behavior and preference and happiness.
Yeah.
By uncovering, sometimes accidentally through a kind of Darwinian winnowing process, by uncovering what it is that works well in the business world, and by being able to codify that, you could then replicate it somewhere else. Now, let's take Five Guys, for instance. I think, I'm not absolutely sure, but Five Guys is very interesting because no one would have thought you could charge $10 for a burger in an environment which is no more exotic than a branch of McDonald's. If anything, it's slightly more rudimentary a setting than a McDonald's is. If you delve a bit deeper, the burger and the shake, the 2 signature items, are the only things that are expensive. You get free drinks refills, you get an extra scoop of fries for free with your fries, you get free peanuts, all the toppings on the burger entirely free, regardless of how many of them you want. Okay? Now, I would argue there's something interesting going on there, which you can learn from, which is, if you have a hero product, you can charge massively in an area where people think money makes a real difference, where there's a real quality opportunity, provided you're remarkably ungreedy everywhere else. And I've had the thesis that in the UK, you could open a place called Bacon Sandwich or Bacon Roll, which only sold bacon rolls. You know, you could have, you know, a couple of accompaniments. You would have a weird rule like, you know, brown sauce is free, but if you want ketchup, you've got to pay 20p for it, just to give the thing a little bit of mental purple cowness, as Seth Godin would call it. And, you know, you'd only have 2 drinks, which would be strong tea and champagne. Would be the only 2 drinks you'd be allowed. You know, you'd have a certain number, but you could then charge £9 for a really, really good bacon roll.
Right. Oh, that's smart.
And I think, you know, quite often very clever things are uncovered almost by accident. They tend to survive, which is a clue to their success. And what we don't spend enough time doing, in fact, I've even noticed that when I started talking to train people about what airlines do, their natural reaction is, that's irrelevant to my sector. I mean, for God's sake, it's trains versus airlines. Right. They're actually pretty similar.
Right.
Okay.
Very, yeah.
Interestingly, it is a prestige and premium thing on an airline to be able to board the plane first.
Right.
I've never seen a train company leaving from a station where it says, first class passengers board first. People actually don't mind whether the train's moving or not. The earlier they can sit on the train, the happier they are.
Right.
Okay. And Roger Martin has written this thing that most creativity happens through metaphor. It's spotting a pattern and transferring it to a new and unexpected place. And yet most people are weirdly uncomfortable with that.
Right.
Sometimes it happens in the film industry. Famously, Alien was pitched as Jaws in space. Okay.
Interesting.
It's basically an old story, which is about a massive, great shark terrorizing things, transferred to a completely new location and transferred to the future. Yeah. I assume Alien takes place in the future, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. And oddly, what is odd about this is, given the value of the process of taking something and actually effectively recontextualizing it, given the creative value of that, it is interesting, as Roger L. Martin points out, that many, many people react with barely concealed hostility when you attempt to do it.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Rory, that's huge. And I think this, it's been great talking to you. I think I want to respect your time. We can wind down now.
I'll leave you with a brief, which is people understand the peak end rule, okay? No one has quite succeeded in making the end of a restaurant meal or the end of a hotel stay brilliant and distinctive. It's just an interesting challenge, because the person who does that might enjoy disproportionate gains.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can think about that across many, many different.
Yeah. How can you make the end of an experience? A band will always play its best song either at the beginning or at the end, mostly, won't they? Okay.
Correct.
If you're the Eagles, I mean, there was a great comedian who complained that he said, I went to see the Eagles in concert in Phoenix, and they bloody well opened with Hotel California. I said, well, what the hell have I got to look forward to for the rest of it?
The rest of the time?
So, I think there are really interesting challenges, which is, how can you take something from somewhere else? Now, I do know one couple of hotels. I stayed in a hotel, the Intercontinental in Phoenix, which I don't think exists anymore as an Intercontinental hotel. But they, at least when they brought your car around, they lavished bottled water on you, which is an appropriate thing to do in Arizona.
Right.
The Manuel Cat Saison make handmade biscuits, and they give you those biscuits for the journey home. Could you give someone a branded thermos to take in their, in the car to the airport? I don't know. Is there some lovely thing you could do which just is, again, above the call and beyond the call of duty, which would add something to the departure of a hotel?
Yeah. No, it's genius. And thinking about that across any sort of offering is really smart.
In fairness, no one's managed to do it.
Yeah.
There are some ingenious hotel solutions. One of my favorite ones is how they manage to limit your water use, which is they put a bath in your room, which is so enormous that you realize that filling it and getting the temperature right would make you late for your meeting. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's also a bath so large that unless you're participating in some sort of orgy, okay, the bath feels completely inappropriate for one person.
Right.
And I always think that's
design.
genius, because effectively you look at the bath, and now a boring person would say, we're going to save water by having a really small bath. A creative person would say, we'll make the bath so goddamn big, everybody thinks we're a luxury hotel. But to be honest, nobody, unless it's Led Zeppelin, no one's going to actually bother to fill it.
Right. Man, you got me choking over here. That's funny.
So you go and have a shower instead.
Right. No, that's a really smart, good observation. Well, Rory, thank you so much for doing this.
Absolute pleasure.
Man, you got me choking. That was really funny.
And you suddenly realize that actually, all around the place, there are these cunning little hacks which influence us in what we do. And that's such an ingenious hack, because you can't grudge it. Nobody said, my TripAdvisor review said the bath is far too big.
Too big,
okay?
right. Exactly.
It's too big. You can't say that. That'd be a ridiculous thing to say.
Yeah.
But actually, you look at it and go, I've actually got, I actually don't have 2 hours to spare to fill this bath.
Exactly. No, that's so true. Rory, that's an awesome place to end. Thank you so much for being on. Where do you want people to connect with you? What you're doing? Obviously, pick up your books.
Any after-sale service, Twitter's the great place to connect. I'm at Rory Sutherland.
Awesome.
All one word. Yeah, easy to do. And I'm generally fairly good at responding, too.
Okay, great. Rory, thank you so much for being on. And thanks to everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, you can get more of these conversations sent directly to your inbox at alexsugg.com. As always, leave a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify for this show. And last but not least, Josh Perez edited this podcast, and he's a great producer, but an even better human being. So if you need help with your show, get in touch with him at justjoshperez.com. I'll be back soon with another new episode. So until then, let's go make something cool.